Team Canada has announced its roster for the hockey team for the Sochi Olympics. I'm Kerry Chow, joined by ESPN hockey writer Scott Burnside, joining us via Skype. Scott, what do you make of the selection?
Well, Gary, it's like Christmas Part 2 in Canada, the anticipation leading up to the announcement of the 25-man roster on Tuesday morning. A few surprises, mostly up front, but boy, it's always an embarrassment of riches when Canada comes down to selecting a roster for these kinds of best-on-best tournaments. Terrific group of players. As always, though, it's the players who didn't make the team that will garner a lot of the attention moving forward.
And speaking of which, who were the biggest snubs to you?
Well, and there were a few of them. Claude Giroux, who's had a terrific stretch for the Philadelphia Flyers, left off. Joe Thornton, a member of the Vancouver team in 2010 that won gold medal, top 5 point producer in the NHL, left off that roster as well. I would have to say that Logan Couture, I feel really bad for him, came down with an injury. He's going to require surgery. Will likely be back right around the start of the Olympics, but that injury likely cost him a roster spot. And maybe for me, the guy that I was hoping the most for was Martin St. Louis. He was not taken to Vancouver in 2010. Really a heart and soul player for the Tampa Bay Lightning, and he was left off the roster as well. Steven Stamkos named to the roster. Of course, he's recovering from a broken tibia. He would be the wild card. He's back skating. He is really pressing to get back in the lineup and be ready for the tournament, which begins for Canada on February 13th. He is a guy that Team Canada will be watching, and fans will be watching very closely, as he's an obvious player that could come off and require a replacement. My guess would be Claude Giroux would be the #1 guy right now, but that's my guess.
As you mentioned, so many big names, really an embarrassment of riches, again, as you mentioned. Is this team poised to become the repeat as gold medalists?
Well, I mean, talent-wise, they are going to be right up there. You would have to figure they would be among the top 2 or 3 teams on paper heading into this tournament. But of course, it's worth noting again that in the 2 tournaments in which NHL players have played in the Olympic Games since this began back in 1998, neither Canada nor the United States has managed a medal of any flavor while playing in Europe. So as we talked about with the USA selection, no different for Canada. How does this team translate its high degree of talent and skill to the big ice surface in Sochi? And how do they compete against players who grew up playing on those kinds of surfaces, whether it's Sweden or Russia, the Czech Republic, Finland? Those players all have that big ice in their DNA. Transition will be much more difficult for Canada than the United States in this tournament.
So then, if not U.S. or Canada, as you mentioned, would Russia then be the favorites?
But so I would think Russia. It's hard to know how the intense pressure to perform with the games in Russia, how does that affect that Russian squad? But very highly skilled. Pavel Datsyuk, Alexander Ovechkin, Evgeny Malkin. Boy, they are going to be loaded for bear. And the other team I think to watch, Sweden. Very balanced. They're very similar to me to Canada in the sense that the balance in terms of skill and terrific two-way play up and down that Swedish lineup is almost unparalleled. For me, what are the Swedes going to get from Henrik Lundqvist in goal? Hasn't been a great season for the New York Ranger netminder, so that would be maybe one tiny red flag. But I think you have to look at Russia, Sweden, Canada, and the United States. But of course, in these tournaments, sometimes in a single elimination game, one bounce and who knows what happens. But I think those are the 4 teams that would be, on paper at least, the favorites to win gold.
Certainly should be very exciting. Sochi Olympics start February 7th. Good stuff from ESPN hockey writer Scott Burnside joining us via Skype. Scott, we appreciate it as always. I'm Kerry Chow with your latest ESPN headline.